This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac, 28 minutes of stories about Ukrainian life. We come to you from the campus of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. Nasha Kasha is heard on 14 campus and community radio stations in 8 provinces, from Newfoundland to British Columbia. I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak. Vitayu. Welcome. This is episode 155. May 15th, 2019. The online edition of the Kyiv Post reads as follows, quote, "Dozens of people gathered at the Ukrainian Institute in London, England on May 13th to hear prominent Ukrainian journalist, writer, and commentator Vitaly Portnikov's reflection on Ukraine's politics. The outcome of the presidential election reminds him of Murder on the Orient Express, the detective novel by British writer Agatha Christie." End of quote. The election, Portnikov went on to say, was like a mystery on a train with no driver. Volodymyr Zelensky is an actor who played Ukraine's president in the TV series Servant of the People. He defeated Ukraine's real president, Petro Poroshenko, capturing 73% of the vote on April 21st. Today, Nasha Kasha goes to Toronto. You'll hear from a distinguished academic and Ukraine advisor, then to Montreal and an interview with the past president of the Ukrainian World Congress. We'll hear about the lead-up to Ukraine's massive leadership shift and of the country's potential. Who's driving the train? Well, it just may be the people of Ukraine. You're listening to the Murder on the Orient Express theme. It's by Richard Rodney Bennett from the original 1974 movie soundtrack. Marcus Dawes conducting the orchestra of the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden.
Basil Kaliman. I am a professor emeritus of the Richard Ivey School of Business. I was born on the border of Ukraine in an area that is currently Poland. I just have one sister. There was no history in Canada. They emigrated during the war, basically escaping the communists, and we lived initially in Germany for 5 years, subsequently in Australia for 5 years, and then we emigrated to Canada, where I've lived most of my life. I was approximately 10 years old, and I attended Ukrainian school on Saturdays, and I participated in Plast. Early on, I was not into politics. I was more into econometrics and economics, and then I did graduate work at Yale, where I did my thesis in the area of management science and wrote theoretical works related to finance.
What is it that drew you, that fascinated you about statistics of all things?
I always was a good student of mathematics, and I followed my interests. The family always has had a commercial background. My parents had a business in Ukraine, actually, and subsequently when they migrated here. So I always had an interest in business, and finance was an interesting combination of business and theory. Having a PhD, I was fortunate to get a teaching position at UCLA as an initial posting, and I continued from there.
What kind of a business was it in Ukraine?
My grandparent, I believe, started a wholesale fruit business where they would buy the output of orchards, and then they had a warehouse in view, and they would then sell to retailers.
You found your way to the Ivey Business School and teaching of finance?
I started my teaching career at the UCLA at the business school. I returned to Toronto to the Rotman School at the University of Toronto. I left for a couple of years and taught at the Harvard Business School, and eventually came back to Toronto. And most of my career was at the University of Toronto at the Rotman Business School. And then for about a decade, towards the end of my career, I taught with the Richard Ivey Business School. So that was my basic career. I always had a consulting practice in Canada, but my interest in Ukraine started in about 1988 when Gorbachev had announced perestroika. At that point, I was invited to speak at a conference in Kyiv on economic perestroika. So that started it. From that time on, I would regularly go to Ukraine, and when the business schools started to appear in Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, I was invited to lecture there.
Perestroika is certainly seen by the West as a period of opportunity and probably by people there.
Perestroika wasn't serious. They were just trying to save communism, which was going down the tubes.
Could you characterize Ukraine's trying to leave communist days and attitudes behind?
It has been a very painful process. Ukraine really was, for many years after independence, under the control of the former Soviet nomenclature, people like Khrushchev and Kuchma. Really, even Poroshenko is a person from the old system still. These people, especially the early ones, had no interest in real reform. They always hid behind the concept of we have to go slowly. But in truth, they actually took over all of the assets that were used to be owned by the states. They ended up privatizing them and creating the oligarch system.
In 2014, you co-authored a paper that spoke to the need for speedier progress in attaining rule of law, corruption reduction, agricultural land reform, tax code simplification, bureaucratic restructuring, economic stability. Can you hearken back to those recommendations and put them in perspective?
They were post-Maidan, just right after Maidan, when a close associate and friend of mine, Pavlos Sheremetyev, became the Minister of Economics, and we assembled a group of knowledgeable economists. I chaired that group, and we prepared a series of recommendations for reforms. And the ones that you mentioned are basically, those are the things that we're emphasizing. The need for the rule of law, etc., macro stability. It's a very complicated set of issues. Those were developed at that time, and the need to move much more quickly than Ukraine had ever moved was on our agenda, but never realized.
2014, Putin had already invaded Crimea.
Yes, the war and Russia's war against Ukraine has damaged Ukraine's economy, but that's not the reason why reforms were not done. There's a very small group of people have really exploited the economy, monopolized different areas, and really have not permitted the normal functioning of the rule of law and the evolution of a normal market economy. The war has been very detrimental to the economy, there's no question, but that's not the only issue.
Could you characterize Canadians and Americans of Ukrainian background and their feeling that it was really Poroshenko who we should back?
Poroshenko, certainly I would credit him with some reforms, but unfortunately, in the area of rule of law and the basic rule and the control of the economy by the oligarchs, he did not do anything. And that is a very fundamental flaw of his period. He did organize and upgrade the army, which had been decimated under Yanukovych, and absolutely that is to his credit. But in terms of oligarchic control of the economy and rule of law, he did not, in fact, succeed in that regard.
So what does the election tell us and foretell?
I think the election, it is a sea change. It's a generational change. Zelensky is a very young man, and he was never involved in the old system, as have been all the previous rulers. He's backed he was fortunate to be elected mainly because he has such name recognition, mostly because of his Servant of the People television program about a president, but much more than that. He had a production company which was very successful in many, many different productions and films. And then he used social media. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is a breakout of a new generation and possibly new thinking.
Where does it leave the people who've backed Poroshenko? Where does it leave us in the West?
Well, Poroshenko moves into history just the same way that Yanukovych moved into history, that Yushchenko moved into history, that Khrushchev moved into history. Some of these, Yanukovych was totally black, and I wouldn't say that about Poroshenko. He has to get much more credit than that. But he was seriously flawed as a president. Whether Zelensky will be great or not, we will see. It is a bit of a roll of the dice because he has no experience. I'm hopeful for the Zelensky presidency. I think there is no use. The diaspora in the West regrets the loss of Poroshenko. Personally, I'm not as concerned because I feel that his rule of law was, he never met the standard of rule of law that I would have liked to see, and held back the economy. Poroshenko espoused a lot of nationalistic ideals. Unfortunately, Ukraine is suffering from economic depression and is losing people. And that reason for that is the oligarchical rule of the economy, in which exploits the economy at the risk of poverty for the masses in Ukraine.
We in Canada had an oligarchy. It was called the Family Compact, and they built railroads, and somehow we've risen out of that. Is there a lesson to be learned in Ukraine's case?
I don't think so. Canada never had communism. The current oligarchs didn't really build anything. They just stole everything from the public because it was all in public hands. So there's a very significant difference between the family compacts of the past, including in the United States. They built railroads, they built factories, they built a lot of things. And yes, they were, in some ways, they're called robber barons, but they built things. Unfortunately, the oligarchs of Ukraine just stole things from the state. That's how they got rich. I've been in Ukraine many times, and they have a great IT industry, for example, a lot of young, small companies doing tremendous work. The problem is that all of these smaller enterprises don't have a chance in that system because it's so controlled and monopolized by the oligarchs that these people don't have a chance to fully develop. Land has been tied up. Farmers cannot sell their land. They were granted land rights, supposedly, and they can't exercise them because certainly monopolistic large agro-industries don't want them to have that freedom to compete. Deregulation, for example, creating a market in land and removing the bureaucrats that are blocking a lot of businesses by basically demanding bribes for anything they need from the state is one way to kill corruption, or to, let's say, to reduce corruption. You never get rid of corruption totally.
What needs to happen in the parliamentary elections to assist Ukraine at this time?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that unless Zelensky obtains a working coalition in the parliament, in the next parliament, he doesn't have it at all at present, but he needs that. The elections are coming up in the fall, if not sooner. And he needs a working coalition and he is organizing, obviously, a party. Having obtained such a high percentage of votes in the current presidential election, I would expect that he's going to get a significant block of members of parliament, and then he needs other parties that could work with him in order to get laws through, because if he doesn't have any control, not full control, but if he doesn't have any working coalition in the parliament, he'll be tremendously hampered in being able to do almost anything. Ukraine is changing. Ukraine is, the younger people are fed up with the control of the oligarchs and the corruption that they have generated and the lack of rule of law and pocket judges and all of that. They're totally sick of that, and they want to break out of that. They want to have a more normal existence. And that's the message, I think.
Бандуристи, орле сизий, добре тобі, брате, маєш крила, маєш силу, є коли літати. Тепер летиш в Україну, тебе виглядають, полетів би я з тобою, та хто привітає.
Nasha Kasha, Banduriste Orlisizi, a song about a bandurist referred to as Grey Eagle. The Grey Eagle you are about to meet is perched on the 40th floor of Place Ville-Marie in Montreal. He's a senior partner with Quebec's leading law firm, Lavery.
My name is Eugene Joly, and I'm former president of the Ukrainian World Congress, a lawyer by profession, and was very active in various roles in the Ukrainian community, both in Montreal and on the international scene.
You were born and raised in Montreal. Can you tell me about your family and tell me a little bit about your formation?
towards the end of the Second World War, as the Germans were being pushed off and before the Russians took fully control of the Ukrainian territory. My grandparents took my parents and emigrated to Canada. My grandfather was a priest. My mother was an opera singer and director of many choirs. My father, he was an extremely competent engineer, was working in Canadair, was in charge of the whole braking systems of airplanes, and then for 5 years did a project in Kingston putting together a metro above ground. And he eventually, at one point, when the director of our Ukrainian credit union in Montreal passed away, he left that to sacrifice his professional career in order to become a director of our Ukrainian credit union. He was an engineer and in charge of the construction of the Ukrainian Cultural Center in Montreal.
But you didn't go into engineering yourself. You went into law.
I sat down once with my father and he told me, if you don't know for sure what to go into law, because this is a good basis to go thereafter to any other field that you may want. I liked the idea and still do to represent individuals and to defend causes.
You are a senior partner. You've appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada.
I litigate commercial and corporate matters. I'm also an expert in insolvency and restructuring of companies that are in financial difficulty. So I've pleaded before all levels, from the Superior Court to the Court of Appeal, and I had the pleasure of defending several cases actually before the Supreme Court of Canada, one against the government of Quebec. So it was a fascinating case that I won, which gave me a lot of satisfaction.
Your reputation among your friends is that you're a very tough litigator.
Let's put it this way. I try to the best of my ability to defend my clients in a manner that ensures victory. I hate to lose. But you also need, as a competent lawyer, to be able to have that distance, to be able to advise your client in a professional manner. Yes, I prepare very hard and I litigate very tough.
You've been on the board of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress in Canada. You've been leader of that organization at one point, and now you've just ended your second 5-year term, a total of a decade as the head of the Ukrainian World Congress. Is this a good time to ask? We're sitting at 7:30, 8 o'clock at night in your office. You're going to be working after I leave. How do you time manage all of that?
I just don't count the hours anymore. For me, for the last 10 years, it's essentially meant that every day was a working day. For the last 10 years, I did not take any vacations, and I worked tremendously long hours in order to combine an active practice, and I combined it with extremely demanding and active work as president of the Ukrainian World Congress, especially during the years when Ukraine was the object of Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, the whole Euromaidan, the occupation of Crimea. So those were very challenging, difficult moments that required a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of traveling.
The United Nations Economic and Social Council has recognized the Ukrainian World Congress as a non-governmental organization. Can you talk about that status, and then maybe a little bit about introducing yourself? What's your calling card going to speak to world leaders when you're not actually the representative of a country, you're the representative of an interest group?
The calling card is, I say that I represent the interests of Ukrainians living outside of Ukraine, and there are, according to our calculations, it's not precise math because in various countries there are no censuses, but essentially 20 million Ukrainians living outside of Ukraine, about 62 countries with member organizations or associate organizations that pull their efforts together in order for us to develop an agenda.
So your currency comes through the umbrella groups in each of these 62 countries voting and saying you're the guy that they want to send out into the world to represent their thoughts?
Yes.
You must have met some fascinating people around the world in those 10 years.
Well, I was actually probably one of the few presidents of the Ukrainian World Congress that had quasi a double role. You're absolutely right that I do not represent the Ukrainian state, but there was a period during the presidency of President Yanukovych where the Ukrainian World Congress took a tough stand where we essentially said that we and not the government of Ukraine represent the interests of Ukrainians in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine wants to turn fully and move in the direction of Europe, wants to become a member of the EU, wants to become a member of NATO, and ultimately with the Euromaidan, we were proven right. That was actually the will of the Ukrainian people. And during the period preceding the Maidan and during the Maidan, in many countries, they did not particularly want to invite President Yanukovych to any event. So for those events, I had the opportunity to get a visit of a state leader.
Can you remember at what point in that revolution did world leaders more and more turn to you and say, okay, now we want to listen to you?
Well, the triggering event of the Maidan was, as you know, when President Yanukovych turned his back to the EU and said he will not sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. And I, in Lithuania, was speaking to all of the chairs of the foreign affairs committees of all the EU member states. It was in the Lithuanian parliament, and that was probably one of the highlights of my presidency.
Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, Poroshenko, now Zelensky. I listed 6 Ukrainian presidents. You were there as World Congress leader for Yushchenko, Yanukovych, Poroshenko. Any recollections of Yushchenko as the Orange Revolution started and he went through his personal physical crisis and then rose from that to become a leader? A banker turned politician, an individual that was poisoned, that went through tremendous physical challenges. I remember a meeting when I was sitting in front of him, a couple of days after he walked out from the hospital. During the whole meeting, I thought that one of his ears would just drop. It was an incredible hardship that he had to endure and to suffer. Physically, looking at his face, you felt this?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a face that was ravaged, and I could just imagine the rest of the body. That an individual that would have suffered so much would still continue. He certainly inspired awe.
And as leader, he eventually faltered somewhat. Or is that too harsh a statement?
I think that unfortunately there was a period where he and the Prime Minister of Ukraine did not see eye to eye. They were not able to put their differences aside for the better cause of the country. When one looks back at his presidency, one looks at it from unfortunately with that feeling that it was a lost opportunity that eventually led to the Yanukovych presidency and to the hardship that the Ukrainians had to suffer during the Maidans. So although he managed to do some tremendous things, including the recognition both in Ukraine and then by the international community of the Holodomor of 1932-33 as a genocide against the Ukrainian people, which was a very important achievement. But at the same time, like I said, unfortunately, they did not have that discipline to put their personal ambitions on the side and to decide for the best interest of the country.
Ukrainians rose out of the conflict of the Maidan to elect Poroshenko. Can you reflect on Poroshenko briefly?
President Poroshenko had a very difficult challenge in front of him, and I think that I still recall during his inauguration, he told the Ukrainian people that I will try my best in order to ensure I can bring peace to Ukraine. This obviously he has tried with various diplomatic route, with the Minsk agreements. He has been able to transform a totally ineffective army into a powerful, very effective army that today is able to withstand constant Russian aggression. So he did some tremendous things, but he was obviously confronted with a country that was extremely weak after President Yanukovych, where President Putin took full advantage of the situation.
And he did not come through on his promise to fully deal with corruption?
I think that he has done some steps in order to address that issue, including the creation of the anti-corruption court, with the creation of various bodies that are in charge of dealing with corruption. So he has. I don't think it would be unfair to say that he has not addressed the issue. I think that he probably was not successful enough to ensure that corruption is lowered to an acceptable level. As in many European countries, people tend today to go anti-establishment, to take somebody that really is outside of the box, somebody that is not associated with the leadership in the last 5 years or 10 years, depending on the country. Zelensky is a young person. He had a very, very good campaign. He demonstrated that you can win an election through social media. He obviously also promised something that Ukrainians wanted to hear. He promised that he would break the corruption network in Ukraine and dismantle it. By and large, if you would ask Ukrainians that actually analyzed the issues fully, they would probably put the importance of protecting Ukraine's territorial integrity as a first and most important issue, and probably the second most important would be to fight corruption, which is an internal evil that essentially makes people suffer tremendously. I certainly hope that first of all, that the parliamentary elections will be as clean and transparent as were the presidential elections. The biggest winner was democracy. Ukraine has clearly demonstrated that it's a democratic state. What Ukraine needs to elect is an effective parliament with individuals that want to be in parliament not because they have immunity, but of individuals that want to sit in parliament and serve the people of Ukraine.
Is there something you want to say that I haven't asked?
I would certainly encourage other Ukrainians to get involved in community life. There are challenges, and yes, there are sacrifices to be made, but you really get a lot of enrichment.
Thank you for finding the time to talk to me.
It was a pleasure.
Маєш крила, маєш силу, є коли літати. Тепер летиш в Україну, тебе виглядають. Полетів би я з тобою, та хто привітає.
Nasha Kasha is also a podcast. Subscribe for free wherever you find your podcasts. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha is provided by the Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko and the Ukrainian Credit Union. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі. За тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.